Welcome back, pilots. This is day 2 of my travel by glider adventure to Warner Springs. Yesterday, 3 friends and I flew down here from Hollister, a straight line distance of 558 kilometers. Today we're going to try to fly back to Hollister to close the travel by glider loop. The forecast for today doesn't look quite as good as it did yesterday. SkySight is showing fewer and lower clouds than yesterday. But yesterday, SkySight undercalled the amount of moisture and therefore clouds that were present, so we're hoping the same will be true today. Rami and Philip have launched before me, and I get off the ground around 10:30. It isn't long until we tow into a strong thermal, and I get off tow a little earlier than I'd planned. Getting off tow early will put me even further behind the guys who launched first, but it does make for a cheaper tow. That last climb was in the blue, but now I've got the altitude to get to the clouds over the mountains. These particular clouds don't look that great, and when I get there I'm not surprised to find nothing going on under them. This is where the other guys found a climb, but that thermal is long gone. I'm getting low, so I'm forced to retreat back toward a landing place to continue my search. Fortunately, I run into a boomer, and I ride it upward for a gain of 3,000 feet. Warner Springs is only about 50 miles north of the Mexican border, so our plan was to fly south first, tag the border, then head north to Hollister. I can see a few clouds far to the south, but I'm going to have to cross a substantial blue gap to get there. I zigzag around, trying to get one more climb before I cross the blue gap, but it was all for nothing. I should have just gone for it. It turns out I didn't really need a climb anyway. A decent cloud finally appears, and I get a good climb out of it. I continue to be plagued by camera issues. On this flight, the power cable that normally supplies power to the camera broke, so I had to rely on the camera's internal battery, and I only have 2 of them. You'll be seeing time-lapse sequences that are shorter than usual in this video, but I did manage to make the 2 batteries last the entire flight. New clouds continue to appear as the thermal activity ramps up. At this point, Rami and Philip have already reached the Mexican border and have turned back north. As we converge, I turn around and join them. I'm not as optimistic about the forecast as the other guys. I think it's going to be a race to get to Hollister before the thermals stop working, and I don't want to waste any more time on this little detour. Darren continues on to the border, and that puts him far enough behind us that we won't see him again for the rest of the flight. I'm going to spend some time in the rest of this video analyzing the performance and decision-making of the remaining 3 of us. First, let's talk about the gliders. Philip is flying a JS3, which is one of the latest and greatest 18-meter gliders available. Rami is in an ASG 29. The 29 has been around for years, but the performance is only slightly lower than the JS3. Lastly, we have my glider, the LS6C. My glider is the oldest and least expensive of the bunch, but the best glide ratio is only slightly lower than the ASG 29. However, the glide ratio of my glider at higher speeds is substantially lower than the other 2 gliders. This will come into play today since we're flying in strong conditions. At this point, Philip is starting to get a bit low. He hasn't climbed in a while, probably because he's holding out for a stronger thermal. I have my McCready set to 4, which means I'll take a thermal that's 4 knots or better. Philip has gotten low enough that he can't continue on without a climb. He's forced to hunt around for a thermal off course, which will dramatically slow him down and cause him to fall behind. For now. The soaring game is all about speed. An ambitious glider pilot is always trying to learn how to fly faster. One great way to learn is to compare your performance to other pilots who are flying in the same conditions. This flight gives us a great opportunity to do that. We'll see how each pilot's decision-making impacts their speed relative to the others. The differences in performance between our gliders will play some role, but decision-making can have a much larger impact. A glider pilot has to decide when to stop and climb, and when to hold out for a stronger one. Route choice is also important. We're all headed in the same direction, but we sometimes take different lines to get there. This cloud in front of me is the last one before we have to cross the pass between Mount San Jacinto and San Gorgonio Mountain. Rami hunts around for a climb before crossing the pass, but doesn't find anything. I would have done the same thing, but since I'm following close behind him, I can see that he didn't find anything, so I don't have to waste my time looking for something. This allows me to catch up with him a little bit. Now we're crossing the pass, and the situation ahead doesn't look great. The cloud straight ahead is reachable, but it doesn't have a flat bottom, so it may not have a thermal under it. If it doesn't work, I won't have any other options. These clouds are too far away, and these clouds are way off course and in a direction with no landing options. Rami and I arrive under the big cloud and find nothing. I continue past the cloud and push deeper into the mountains. That's where my best chance of finding a thermal will be. If I fall off into the valley, my chances of getting back up are slim to none. This might be something.
There we go.
Rami and I find climbs at the same time. Rami went 90 degrees off course to find his, but his was stronger, as you can see by the increased vertical space between his circles. Because of that, we're still pretty close together. One more climb and we'll be on top of San Gorgonio Mountain. I've climbed 5,000 feet since crossing the pass, but I'm not out of the woods yet. We need to cross these mountains around Big Bear, but there are only sparse and small clouds ahead. It's time to shift gears. I'm going to fly slower and conserve my altitude because I don't know when the next climb is going to come. Bill Palmer and X-Ray Delta joined Rami and I in this thermal. Check out his YouTube channel. After a long glide without a climb, we finally reach the foothills of Mount Baldy. There's a big cloud here, and it produces just as we expected. Notice how Rami always leaves the thermal one circle before I do. Staying in the thermal for one more circle drags down my average climb rate and my cross-country speed. I need to get better at leaving the thermal at the first sign of it weakening. Notice that Philip is catching up to us. Let's take a look at how he did this. Instead of shifting gears and slowing down and playing it safe, Philip flew fast, took a more direct route, and got low, but he found a pair of strong climbs that made up for it, and that allowed him to nearly catch up with us. That was a bold gamble, but he got away with it and made up a lot of ground. The spectacular view of Mount Baldy is our reward for all the hard work it took to get here. But it's not even 2 o'clock yet, and we've got a long way to go. Another blue gap lies ahead, and this one's even larger. I'm still in low gear here, taking weaker climbs and staying as high as I can. Only the tiniest wisps mark where the convergence must be. I'm starting to think that this might not be possible. Rami must have been thinking the same thing, because he peels off over the Mojave Desert toward a distant bank of clouds. Meanwhile, I scratch for altitude in progressively weaker lift. I decide to stay the course and follow the mountains, despite the lack of clouds. If this were a normal flight, I'd have turned back for home by now. But it's a straight out, so it's Hollister or bust. Rami has reconsidered his plan and merged back with Philip and I. Speaking of Philip, he kept flying fast and has now passed us both. We finally reach an area with clouds around Agua Dulce. I'm getting a bit low and I could use a climb right now. I take a couple circles in a weak thermal, but pass it up. I'll soon come to regret this. I keep getting lower, but so do the clouds, and there isn't much lift under them. At this point, I make sort of a strange decision to go 90 degrees off course to a good-looking cloud. This is a move that should only be done in desperation, but I wasn't that low. I can only guess that I was thinking that this was the last good cloud before I had to cross another blue gap. These remaining clouds before the gap don't look so great, and Rami didn't find anything under them, so maybe my little detour wasn't so bad after all. I do end up catching up with him. Meanwhile, Philip makes another bold move. Instead of jumping to the next set of clouds, he cuts the corner over the grapevine, where there are no clouds whatsoever. He dips below 6,000 feet, but then finds a climb in the blue, which saves the day. Rami and I make our way across the blue gap, cruising slowly and conserving altitude. We also manage to find a decent climb in the blue, which ensures that we're going to make it across this blue gap. We reach the clouds on the other side, but they're pretty scrappy looking and don't have much under them. Rami begins to slowly pull away from me here. I'm uncomfortable flying over this unlandable terrain, so I'm collecting every scrap of altitude I can get. Rami also happens to be flying fully ballasted, while I am not. I wasn't able to fit my water filling equipment in the glider, so I couldn't fill up at Warner Springs this morning. Despite that, I've managed to keep up for about half the flight at least. This goes back to my earlier point about decision-making accounting for a much bigger difference in speed than glider performance. Decisions like what route to take, when to stop and climb, and which cloud looks best can have a huge impact on the speed you make toward your goal. One or two bad decisions can dramatically reduce your average speed over the flight. Flying fast is a game of risk management. Flying aggressively can improve your speed, but it also increases the risk of making a big mistake that costs you a lot of time. A glider pilot has to be constantly seeking the right balance between risk and reward. To be clear, when I talk about risk in the context of cross-country speed, I'm talking about sporting risk, not safety risk. Sporting risk is the risk that you may not achieve your sporting goals, such as flying fast or making it home. Safety risk is exactly what it sounds like. It's physical risk to persons or property. We made it to the New Cuyama area, and we're back in the good stuff again. There are some great-looking cloud streets ahead, and we're starting to get strong climbs again. I figured this is my chance to catch up with Rami, so I pushed the nose down and resolved to not climb in anything less than 5 knots. The clouds stretch as far as I can see, so right now I'm feeling pretty optimistic about making it back to Hollister. I'm slowly catching up with Rami, and Philip's still ahead of both of us thanks to that shortcut he took over the grapevine. I've reached the north end of the California Valley, and as usual there's a transition to be made over to the next mountain range. The cloud street I'm on is no longer continuous, but this big cloud ahead looks promising. I find some lift under it, but it's not 5 knots, so I continue on. This turns out to be a big mistake. The options ahead don't look great, and I'm starting to get a little low. My brain is still in go fast mode, but I failed to recognize that this is not going to be an easy transition. I fall below 6,000 feet. If I don't find a climb under these clouds, I'm going to land out at Avenal. I'm forced to turn off course to find a climb, and this is going to really slow me down. I'm not finding anything here. I don't have the altitude to try another set of clouds, so I double back, hoping that there's a core under these clouds that I missed. This will have to do. It's not strong, but I'm out of options. The lift gets stronger as I gain altitude, and it turns out to be a decent climb. But the time I had to spend looking for this climb has put me far behind. The lesson here is that I should have recognized that I wasn't going to be able to blast through this transition at McCready 5. I should have slowed down and gotten less selective about my thermals. Taking that weaker climb that I passed up would have slowed me down only a little bit, but it would have saved me from wasting a lot of time searching for a climb way off course. Anyway, I'm happy to be back in the good stuff now. After a couple of strong climbs, I'm back up at Cloud Base again. Once I make it to the end of this cloud street, I should have Hollister in final glide. Philip and I pass each other in the air as he's on his way back down to Avenal. That last climb was a bit anemic. It seems like the day is starting to die. I'd better take every bit of altitude I can get from here on out. Hollister is still over 100 kilometers away. It's going to be a race to get final glide to Hollister before the lift dies. Little by little, I scratch up what I can. I know that Rami's ahead of me, and he already has final glide to Hollister. A moment ago, it seemed like there were plenty of clouds around, but I've suddenly become aware that they're rapidly disappearing. This cloud ahead of me might be my last chance to get a little more altitude. I put another 1,000 feet in the bank, but I'm not sure that's going to be enough. Hollister is still over 60 miles away, and I'm 2,600 feet below a McCready 4 glide. Maybe I can squeeze just a little more altitude out of these wispies ahead. Somehow, I managed to scratch up another 1,000 feet. Is that going to be enough? I set off on an 88-kilometer final glide to Hollister. I need to make a 30-to-1 glide to reach the airport. That should be possible in theory, but anyone who flies from Hollister knows that it's not that simple. The valley where Hollister lies is often inundated with stable marine air in the afternoon. That air flows southeast through the valley, shutting down all the thermal activity, and presents a headwind that increases as you descend toward Hollister. You never know how strong that headwind is going to be, and that makes it difficult to judge whether or not you're going to make it to Hollister. My very first land out occurred on a final glide to Hollister, just like this one. At first, it appeared that I had plenty of altitude to make it to Hollister, but as I descended, the headwind got stronger and stronger, and I ended up falling far short of the airport. This time, I'm trying a slightly different tactic. Instead of flying directly toward Hollister, I'm taking a more easterly route. My hope is that staying over the high ground will keep me in the convergence for longer and avoid the strongest wind in the valley. It looks like it's working. The headwind has decreased, and I'm above glide to Hollister. It looks like I've got this one in the bag. I'm going to close the loop on my travel by glider adventure by making it back to where it all started.
Hollister traffic, glider 7, left downwind for 24, Hollister.
Looking back to the beginning of the flight, turning north before reaching the Mexican border was a very good decision. Had I arrived at those last clouds 15 or 30 minutes later, I may not have been able to get final glide. What an adventure. This was a real confidence building flight for me. Something about soaring out into the unknown, without crew, and making it back, gives me confidence to try more ambitious flights like this one. After that long, tense final glide, it feels so good to be back on the ground. Yes. Thanks for watching. See you next time.